This is episode 315 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, I'm hopefully maybe not the first, but among the people to wish you a happy Independence Day.
Yes, happy Independence Day. I heard you say earlier you weren't a big fan of fireworks. You would have not wanted to be in our neighborhood, Paul. There was a few that I think might have been illegal based on how high in the air they were.
Yeah, actually spent the 4th at the Tamaya Resort, which is a lovely place to stay if you want to get away from the big booms. And we learned a valuable lesson that the dogs would probably also be welcome guests at the Tamaya and would benefit from a evening away from the booms as well. That was a adventure for my wife, who came back to the house to stay with them and endure a lot of loud explosions around the house. As a full-blooded American, I love Independence Day. It's 245 years. Obviously, as somebody who's lived through the last year and 5 months, willingness to light up projectiles is not the same as asserting one's actual independence. And I wish we had a little more of the willingness to actually assert people's independence from, let's just start with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, as and her rules and regulations, put legislators in office who are also willing to assert their independence from the governor, and in general fight back against people who exert a level of control that the British and King George III could never have contemplated. I think the biggest aspect of the Constitution that comes somewhat close to what we've seen over the last year and 5 months or so is the quartering of troops in people's houses. That amendment, that seems particularly invasive. That hasn't happened under the Constitution, never really. Wonder if they've had any litigation over that one over the years, but that one is pretty secure. But that seems about as invasive of a thing that is protected by the Constitution against, and it's interesting because it seems like we've had everything but the quartering of troops over the last year and 5 months. But we're not going to dwell on that overly in our conversation here, Wally. But you had a good day, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. Grandchildren were here visiting from out of town. That was nice. And our family pet, Lalo the cat, he could care less about, he's a very shy little kitty, but he could care less about fireworks. Didn't bother him in the least. So that was good.
Good. Well, I don't know. There's some difference between dogs and kitty cats in a lot of areas, but that is one of them. Well, I want to get straight to it. Errorsofenchantment.com. You can find the majority of these stories. The post is Data and Polling Highlight New Mexico's Poor Governance. And it really gets to the idea that people may not necessarily, especially here in the land of enchantment, exert their independence as willingly as they are to exert their right to blow things up. I'll start with the WalletHub report. And it's easy to let your eyes glaze over when you hear all the bad data about New Mexico, the top of all the bad lists, the bottom of all the good lists. WalletHub is at it again. And, I think while there's a few caveats to this report, they generally hit the nail on the head. And sadly, it is that 2021's Best States to Live In Index, June 15th, 2021. So it's been out a couple weeks, but they rate, does WalletHub, a variety of indicators, some of which are intensely relevant to our day-to-day lives, some not so much. But I think it's safe to say that affordability is relevant. The economy is relevant. Education and health, definitely relevant. Quality of life, some of which includes stuff like restaurants and those kinds of things. It's maybe a little less, but depends on who you're dealing with. And safety. I think safety is fair to say. That's very relevant to people. And the unfortunate reality is that New Mexico came in overall 50th. What made us 50th? Well, we're middle of the pack on affordability. I think that's a fair assessment. You always got to check these data points to make sure that they jive with what seems to be the reality out there. New Mexico is more affordable than a lot of places, less affordable than others. Economy-wise, though, we know we tend to be towards the bottom. We are 48th in economy. Education and health, we also know that we're towards the bottom of that, and they find us at 47th. And then quality of life, and I think it's safe to say that our wide open spaces, our lovely weather, give us a boost, 28th. And sadly, in safety, we are 50th, which all comes together to put us dead last, right at the bottom, right below Alaska. And I guess that one depends on your feelings on cold weather. But Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Arkansas, Nevada, and then at the very top, New Jersey, and the data fall where they may. New Jersey, Massachusetts,
with the
New York,
exception of Newark, evidently,
Idaho, as well as Minnesota. And I think there's some fudge factors there, but it is very interesting data. Now, you and I both live in New Mexico. I moved to New Mexico. Some would say that I made a horrendous miscalculation based on the WalletHub report, but let's talk briefly about this, Wally. It seems like the data do hold up to scrutiny, though.
Yes, and this is not a new phenomenon, Paul. It was really a meme before memes existed as a concept, and that is that New Mexico's 47th, 48th, 49th, or 50th in all of the good polls, and this is another indication of that. I did read the post of Errors of Enchantment, and it's not like it's standing out there. This WalletHub is standing out there by itself. There's a couple of other things that, when you have a large, geographically large and disparate state like New Mexico, and believe me, there's other states like that as well. California comes to mind as one that has a lot of different places. So there can be regional, local, and, in places like Albuquerque, even neighborhood differences between things. So, but on average, yes, when all of the numbers are crunched, we're not doing well as a state. And then the question comes, what do we do about it? And I think you're going to get to this a little bit with regard to in terms of where the politics, policy, and results come to. So I don't want to jump the gun here, but if politics is one thing. It's like we're voting for politicians, and in New Mexico that is certainly Democrat politicians, but those politics go into policy that goes into results, and it's one of those things where New Mexico is right now. Any one thing you do in politics, going into policy, it tends to be muted. It's muted by time, and it's muted by the fact that a lot of other things are going on at the same time. But when you look at the totality of all of these things, we haven't necessarily been making good decisions, as we like to tell our children. And as a result, the results we're getting in all of these key areas are not as good. And so what might it take to change that? I'm not sure. I don't have that answer. So
yeah, it's complicated. And of course, you can cite the Voices for Children study. You can cite various economic freedom indices. You could cite business friendliness indexes from across the media and other entities. A big part of this is poverty, and poverty may not be directly related to crime, but it's certainly not totally outside of the crime issue. Of course, if you have money in New Mexico, if you have a good job, you have the weather, you can educate your kids in a system that works for you, then New Mexico is a very pleasant place to live with the outdoor spaces, etc. But I think the upshot is that this is a political problem. And while solving it isn't necessarily simple or straightforward, there are things that are being done and have been done that have certainly not moved us in the right direction. And I would specifically call out the governor's COVID policies over the last year plus. KOB TV, and the reason I didn't just label this the WalletHub Report, I talked about polling. KOB found in separate polls, I guess assume they were taken together, 49% of New Mexicans believe that governor's policies on COVID were just right. 16% said they were too lenient. Now, I want to meet these 16% because
no, you can't, Paul, because they're in their homes with 2 masks on and the door closed. So yeah. I don't think you can meet them.
I agree. And interestingly enough, not surprisingly though, 50% in a poll also released by KOB found that they approved of the governor's performance. It is stunning to me that half of the population of New Mexico, according to any poll, supports what the governor has done over the last year. It has been all over the place. It has not been effective, and it has done one thing, which is kill a lot of businesses, up to 40% of our small businesses and our economy. It's made our children's lives, in many cases, a living hell. In other cases, just overly challenging, really, for what needs to be done. Now, another national poll, and I post this at Errors of Enchantment, found that 57% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats believe the pandemic is, quote, over, which I think highlights things nicely. New Mexico's gone far to the left. It's a blue state. The fear factor involving COVID is largely concentrated on one side of the political spectrum. That happens to be the side of the spectrum that is heavily influential here in New Mexico. And that means that you're getting those high results in terms of the governor's performance. Of course, as I noted, we have the second highest unemployment rate in the nation. The governor, and we'll talk about this more briefly, she's not going to turn down. She's made it explicit. We're taking that $300 as much as we can from unemployment, the Biden administration, and how we're adding on top of it some additional money to get people back to work. So the $300 to stay home, $1,000 to go get a job. There's cross incentives all over the place. Anyway, the point is that one can forgive the voters of New Mexico for electing Lujan Grisham at the beginning. But after a year and a half, 2 years of these policies, it's quite phenomenal to me that she has the level of support that she does. Is it ignorance? Are people just scared? And I know I'm asking you a big question here, Wally, but tell me, do a psychoanalysis of the people of New Mexico as they respond to these polling questions.
Yeah, Paul, am I ignorant or apathetic? I don't know, and I don't care.
These aren't things you can just be. You can't just be apathetic about your children or losing a job. You have to care. You have to care about them.
And there's a couple of books that have the concept that I think explains it. I'm going to answer. And one is Economics in One Lesson by the writer Henry Hazlitt, where when government does something, the benefits are very concentrated. And, so if Paul, if I give you some sort of a handout, a benefit, whether it's justified or not, it doesn't matter. You're going to recognize that, and it's going to be very clear to you. Although the cost to that may be diffused, a lot of people had to pay for that, but they didn't notice it because it wasn't as big. But the problem is in a complex modern economy, a lot of times where everyone gets a little benefit, but boy, you look up and everybody's paying for a lot of things that really are damaging to our economy. And the same thing could happen with COVID policy. It's like, okay, were these policies beneficial at some level in slowing or minimizing the spread of the virus? Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but they were certainly advertised as such. Meanwhile, there's people going out of business. There's children, some of whom probably will literally fall off the edge academically, never to recover. Again, not the best students, not those from families that are very education oriented and have the resources to help their kids get back online, but a lot of them do. And we won't hear about those. You know, those are in New Mexico, politics are always reported as just something that happened. We're never quite sure. We never look back at policies that led to things. So I do think there's a lot of that. And then the other book is the Thomas Sewell book, A Conflict of Visions, where if you look at anything in absolute terms and put that above, you're going to make different decisions. And, you know, the governor made the decision that the only thing she was going to talk about, look at, focus on was COVID-19, the coronavirus. Well, we were saying on the podcast, you and I both, as well as guests we've had from the very early days, is there's a lot of trade-offs here. We wish there weren't. We wish that there was something that you could do, manage the virus and flatten the curve, and it wouldn't have impacts on many, many other areas of our economy, of our quality of life, on children, on other healthcare, but that's just not the case. But when you act like, okay, COVID is it, that's all we needed to do, fine, we'll let the chips fall where they may. Well, what happens is so much of the time, in so many cases, when you focus on one thing, the other side of the coin, the collateral damage, the other diffused sort of problems that happen tend to overcome the good that you got in this one area. And I think that's where we are. Are New Mexico voters looking at it that way? Obviously not. Or they're so partisan that if anything comes out, anything that's a Republican good, Democrat good, anything that's a Republican or any other party is bad. And we've seen a lot of that nationally as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think this is unique to New Mexico, but we have a lot of it's like being loyal to a sports franchise. There's a lot of loyalty. In this case, to the blue team, to the Democrat team. They somehow got blue. I'm not sure why. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of loyalty to that. And when it comes to polling, a lot of cases, I don't think people look much beyond. It's like, I'm a Democrat. This person's a Democrat. I'm for what they did. And the policy and results, not really that important.
I'm not sure whether to be depressed or to be optimistic based on those statements. It certainly does seem that there may be an element of through thick and thin, we're going to support the person who leads our political party, and it kind of makes clear that partisanship. And I'm not saying you're right or wrong, but I will say that the partisanship aspect looms large in New Mexico, and it has across the country. And there are a lot of people out there who, on either side of the issue, certainly have endorsed the activities of the Trump administration or criticized everything Trump did on COVID and, generally speaking, the economy. And then flip side for Biden or Michelle Lujan Grisham, certainly there are ideological inputs as well. People who generally value individual freedom, think average citizens have better knowledge of the various priorities they and their family members have than some politician, whether it's in the Roundhouse or in the White House, that they have superior knowledge to those folks. And I just hope that while this was the most traumatic political and policy event, I would put this above 9/11. 9/11 was a very important and singular incident in American life, but it was a relatively short-term trauma. There were certainly some issues that came up right in the wake of 9/11 and some fears that were also thrust upon the American people, I believe. But This was a year and 5 months, tremendous impacts across, everybody's day-to-day lives, not the least of which is our children. And I just hope that people concerned about their children will rise up, and people concerned about their businesses and the long-term impacts of all of this economic mismanagement, that they will also figure it out, because I just, it shocks me to this day that we can see the kind of support that we have for her and what she's done. But
and just to close, Paul, I don't want to come across as totally negative, but it's one of those, I think in politics, they talk about the pendulum swinging. I think it has to swing people are more pragmatic and more moderate than they think, but the point of it is it has to be there in vivid technicolor. It's one of those, I remember in my youth, there was a president named Jimmy Carter who had out of control inflation, gasoline lines, 55 mile per hour speed limit, and a whole host of other things that happened. And so political parties become not nearly as important when the policies are taking you in such an obviously bad direction. And while I think that arguably to you and I, we feel that we see the policy bad directions without having the final horrendous chapters written, but maybe not the case with the voters in America. And I do think that I'm one of those people that have a great deal of confidence in the voters of America. Over the long run. Over the long run.
That makes one of us there, Wally. All right, well, there's politics and polling, and then there's expressed preference. Now, polling is really catered to the lowest common denominator, because there's a famous phrase out there, opinions are like bleeps, everybody's got one. We won't repeat the exact what they are like, but then there is people with children who have expressed their preferences for homeschooling. And according to the website The 74, which is it deals with education issues, and again, there's a link to this information at Errors of Enchantment. New Mexico is among the largest, the states with the largest percentage outflow of its children, young people, from the traditional public school system. Now, while I would like to see 50 or 90% of New Mexico children get out, and I had my kids in the traditional public schools, but over the last year, what we've seen has been completely unacceptable, with the lingering virtual learning and the poor execution of that. 4.34% of New Mexico's students exited during the school year to go to homeschooling options, and that was one of the highest rates in the entire country. So in addition to all the homeschooling already being done, New Mexico did see a dramatic increase. Noted in the article, of course, is the fact that Albuquerque Public Schools is concerned about losing their $53 million due to the decline in enrollment. Of course, as you teach fewer kids, you should save money on a whole variety of expenses relating to hiring teachers, et cetera, not to mention the potential for school facilities to be closed and repurposed in the longer term, where we are seeing a long-term decline in the number of students in APS, as well as New Mexico's traditional public schools. So many people on my Twitter feed said that this was one of the true beacons of light, because the presumption is, with things being taught in the public schools, not necessarily pro-freedom, that these kids are going to get a better, more wholesome education at home with their parents than during the school year. We'll see what shakes loose as kids return to school. My kids will not be homeschooled next year. At least that's not the plan. They're going to a charter and or Catholic school. So we'll see what this number does. But certainly an interesting data point there, Wally.
Yeah, no doubt about it. People voting with their actions. And, Yeah, this whole education situation we have in New Mexico has gotten to be a very convoluted one. There's certainly extreme power in the educational process with the teachers union in the state, although we are doing okay on the side of charter schools, whether they be the public variety or the private variety. And then the thing that you can use to judge how things are going, we're not going to do. And so we're gonna opt out of testing for a while. So if there's been any big difference, we won't know about it for a long, long time to come here in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, in keeping with the education theme, McKinsey and Company, a big consulting firm, found that the average U.S. child lost the equivalent of 5 to 9 months of learning during the pandemic, with New Mexico being among the most locked down. Not to mention the lack of family structure, people able to be around to help those children, relative lack of broadband access. I would say that we have to be at least on the high side of that issue. And the reason I brought this up is because another blog post, this one cites data from Jason Bedrick of EdChoice. In total, 14 states have enacted 18 new or expanded educational choice policies so far this year. This is another silver lining from the pandemic and what's happened to our children. And while I do briefly cite some of the exciting education reforms, Arkansas created a new tax credit scholarship program for low-income families. Indiana, a new education savings accounts plan system for special needs. Kentucky, a new tax credit ESA for students from low and middle income families. Missouri, new tax credit education savings account for students from low and middle income families. West Virginia, a new ESA education savings account for all students switching out of public school. Now, these are all states with, I believe, red or Republican legislatures. They're not the only ones enacting choice, but let's put it this way. Democrats are beholden to the teachers' unions by and large. They are not going to generally support the kind of choice mechanisms that we and the folks at EdChoice want to see done. There's a reason New Mexico's pretty much been quiet on the education choice and education freedom front. And these are just a handful of states. You'd have to go to the link or find it at Errors of Enchantment to really go through everything. But it's been a very exciting time for school choice.
Yes, and there's two approaches to public education reform. One is that the public schools enact policies and programs that are more effective, and two is that you don't try to reform the mothership, the behemoth, if you will. You allow a more entrepreneurial, smaller scale change to take place. And interestingly, Paul, we're doing a lot better on the second than on the first. There's not been a whole lot of education reform. And I was struck by a recent Tipping Point, New Mexico interview where they talked about education reforms in Alabama that have been highly effective in moving that state's academic achievement above. It was a little bit disconcerting to note that it were all of the things that New Mexico had proposed during the Martinez administration that were uniformly denied as unworkable or not appropriate, or just the union didn't want them, and yet it's been helping Alabama. So yes.
Mississippi.
Mississippi. I'm sorry. So yes, it used to be, it was thank God for Mississippi, Alabama. No, wrong state, right concept. It's interesting. That was depressing to me that another state said, yes, we have these issues and we're going to rally around these policies to make improvement. We're not able to get there so far in New Mexico.
Yeah, it's doubly frustrating, I suppose, here in New Mexico, given the performance of our state and the lack of action on needed reform, both pre-pandemic and as we sit here now with the pandemic. in the rearview mirror, theoretically. Masks TBD. We hope for a very public and pleasing announcement from our governor. I'm not holding my breath, but I would love to see her fully eliminate the mask situation for our students. Now, Rio Grande Foundation won a case at the U.S. Supreme Court this week, which is exciting. This is tis the season when the U.S. Supreme Court issues its rulings, and one of the rulings the Rio Grande Foundation really supported and filed what's called a friend of the court or amicus brief was in a case of Americans for Prosperity. They don't call it California. They actually sue the Attorney General, and the Attorney General changed. But let's say Americans for Prosperity versus California. It's on free speech, donor privacy. The court, in a 6-3 decision, struck a blow in support of donor privacy and organizations like the Rio Grande Foundation, but not by any means limited to them, that we don't have to disclose our donors. We had done battle with the city of Albuquerque, with the city of Santa Fe, and legal battle, as well as political battle with Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, the Secretary of State. Now, I talked to Timothy Sandifer from the Goldwater Institute. He's one of the attorneys out there, and he says that it is not as sweeping of a ruling or pro-donor or privacy as he would have liked, and we'll probably have him on the show in a few weeks to discuss that. But that seems to be the par for the course with John Roberts' opinions. He tries to find the least controversial, most possibly squishy way to approach any given issue. Yet it was the 6-person conservative with John Roberts in that 6-3 majority. But it's good news because it is yet another win for donor privacy at Supreme Court.
Yes, I saw that. It is good news, and it just seems like when you look at things, not completely across the spectrum, but funding for liberal causes seems like it's gotten less scrutiny, and there's been less attack of those donors in the cancel culture or whatever you want to call it these days, and more of that has fallen to conservatives, whether it's businesses, business owners, etc. And so, yes, I think that's a good thing, and it is. Yeah, when I read that, I thought it was maybe more sweeping. Be interesting to see how sweeping it was. But in the meantime, people with dark suits aren't going to come and demand on penalty of imprisonment the donors of organizations like the Rio Grande Foundation. I think that's a good thing. So,
yeah, and finally, can Albuquerque, New Mexico, Albuquerque/New Mexico become a job leader? The Albuquerque Journal had this on the front page.
Adding or killing?
The hope is adding. For
okay,
sure.
Good. Just being clear, because
we've got a long track record of the other, but it's largely a discussion of Albuquerque's economic development, AED's proposals to try to improve, job creation and outcomes for the city. Their president, new person, Danielle Casey, she's the CEO. She would be somebody I'll work on to get on the podcast as well. She replaces Gary Tonjes, who had been in that role for many years. The chart that was shown in the journal, 2014 to 2019, wage growth, and of course, we're starting from a lower level than most, but nonetheless, we are the only state or metro area, I should say, to have below 10% wage growth during that time frame, 2014 to 2019. The U.S. average is 12%. We're at 9.5%. You look at some of the other areas, and they put in a number of them: Boise, Colorado Springs, Dallas, Des Moines, El Paso, Omaha, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Tulsa. Anybody remotely around the broad American West The top performer is Omaha at 16.3% growth. The bottom performer outside of Albuquerque is actually Dallas at 10.7%. But the fact remains is that AED, just as the Rio Grande Foundation, has its work cut out for them if we are going to make New Mexico, make Albuquerque a job or wage growth leader. And the article outlines their priorities and their some of their efforts, mostly focused on the right things. But of course, generally speaking, groups like AED are loath to directly challenge the political structure. And the fact is that we have a mayor who's asleep at the switch on crime. We have a legislature that is hostile to business and free market policy. And it's going to be a tough road to hoe, as it is for us. It will be for AED to make Albuquerque a jobs leader.
Yeah, I mean, I always write down the same 4 or 5 things anytime to these discussions. Crime, public education, the high quality of that, qualified workforce, appropriate regulation as opposed to damaging, inappropriate, heinous, and then tax structure. You handle some combination of those 5 and you will be successful. I believe if any one of them is lacking, I think you're going to be struggling. And unfortunately, I think if any 2 of them are really lacking, it may just be a pipe dream. So,
well, I think you can overcome one major area that you struggle with, but you're right. If you kind of strike out on all 3 or 4 big issues, and just offhand, I would say that crime is obviously one of the big issues. Education system is another. The tax structure is a third. And while New Mexico doesn't have the highest taxes, the gross receipts tax is particularly challenging, arbitrary, and burdensome. So those 3 factors really make things difficult for a lot of businesses that want to come here. So that means we rely on federal government and oil and gas, both of which are nice to have, both of which have their own challenges that they face in terms of really being the building blocks for a strong state, strong local economy. And it's something, economic diversification is a buzzword. Of course, many in the legislature, the esteemed legislature, their idea of economic diversification is let's regulate oil and gas out of existence and then figure out what we're going to do
we'll
later.
see what's going to happen.
Not exactly a game plan to get behind. Lastly, I know I said that before, but we did mention earlier that our governor, speaking of these kinds of policies that don't necessarily make a heck of a lot of sense, keeping the $300 flowing into New Mexico through the unemployment system, the bonus unemployment, that'll stop in September, hopefully, if Congress and the Biden administration don't somehow come up with a plan to extend it. But the flip side is that now the governor has announced $1,000 return to work credit. You have to stay at work, and it fades over time if you don't have a job. But it's just the type of policy that just doesn't make sense. And in a blog posting at Errors of Enchantment, I cited the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration, which throughout the New Deal, one of the reasons it actually prolonged the Great Depression is because many of the policies they put into place actually conflicted with each other. And that's something that one of our heroes here, Amity Shlaes, discussed at length in her seminal book, The Forgotten Man, which is about the Great Depression. So, Wally, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as I read that, it reminded me a little bit as we have a government program that we're paying a lot of money for, but it's doing the wrong thing. So we have to come up with yet another government program to counteract that. It's a little bit like saying, I'm drinking caffeine in the evening, so now I need to take a sleeping pill, without saying maybe we shouldn't have drank caffeine in the evening and we wouldn't have needed the sleeping pill. But, these are these are uncertain times. And then the other thing, just with the $300 is this is in New Mexico where the unemployment rate is actually quite high. So the $300 is probably doing disproportionate damage here compared to places like, say, Utah, where unemployment's at basically record lows. So it's not as big of an impact. It is in New Mexico. So.
Yeah, and there's a somewhat silly and funny meme available. I posted it with the blog post at Errors of Enchantment. Do you know if you press the accelerator and brake pedal at the same time, your car will take a screenshot? Now, in the days of cell phones, everybody gets to press all those random buttons and make something fancy happen on your cell phone. Last but not least, Donald Rumsfeld's passing. He was a supporter of the Rio Grande Foundation. Of course, it was noted in the news stories that Mr. Rumsfeld passed in New Mexico at his beloved home in Taos. And it is a sad day for us at the Rio Grande Foundation. He was a very unique leader with a lot of experiences under his belt. I certainly was not personally a supporter of the Iraq War, and for my personal inclinations, that definitely detracts from Rumsfeld's overall legacy. But he had many different aspects to his career, and many of them were quite successful endeavors, obviously, and certainly a statesman within American history, notably that he passed here in New Mexico, and he was a friend and supporter of the Rio Grande Foundation.
Oh, very good. Yeah, a friend of mine, Paul, lives in Taos, and in the early days when Mr. Rumsfeld was looking for a place, he was there working on his tractor, and this man came up to him while he was working on his tractor for directions, and it was Mr. Rumsfeld. Lived in Taos a long time. I know, like I say, I know he was spotted in New Mexico as one of those places where I think if you are somebody that would be famous and bothered elsewhere, I think he was largely left alone, which is what he liked about Taos. So it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, I think that's something for a lot of folks who come to New Mexico, especially if you have the wherewithal to purchase a large tract of land in a relatively geographically isolated part of the state. And of course, Taos is one of the greatest places in New Mexico, that whole area. It's no accident that a lot of folks who do have that wherewithal have purchased property up there, and Rumsfeld will indeed be missed. And that is where we'll leave it. We have a lovely interview with Doug Messier of Parabolic Arc about the situation at Spaceport America and Richard Branson's decision to attempt a launch here on the 11th of July. But thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com, at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.